So, Princess Anne and Prince William just confirmed something that completely changes how anyone is allowed to look at the youngest Windsor child right now. And honestly, the part that keeps hitting me isn't even the official statement. It's the conversation that happened behind closed doors right before it. The royal family has prepared statements for literally every scenario they can imagine. Accessions, separations, scandals, succession storms, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared them for the moment when William had to stand in front of the country and confirm that his youngest son, Prince Louis, has been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that is going to reshape his childhood. And here's what makes this whole situation so much more complicated than a standard palace health update. William was desperate to control the narrative before anyone else could. Catherine was terrified that her son would be turned into a diagnosis instead of a person. And Princess Anne ended up becoming the only figure strong enough to stand between all of them and the machinery of the monarchy. That's where this gets really interesting, because the diagnosis itself, if the circulating reports are accurate, is serious, affecting coordination, balance, and physical stability. But the real story is how the family fractured in private over whether to tell anyone at all, and how Anne stepped in to basically rewrite the rules of what a royal childhood is supposed to look like. Before we go any further, hit subscribe so you don't miss a single update as this story develops. What makes this feel different from every other palace announcement is that William did not walk into that room at Windsor's, surrounded by communication strategists and press handlers. He walked in with Anne behind him, close enough to steady him, but careful not to make his pain look like weakness. And that single visual tells you almost everything about where the actual power sits inside this family right now. Windsor Castle has witnessed declarations of power for nearly 1,000 years, but this one carried no triumph whatsoever. Household officials waited in absolute silence as William placed both palms on the table and began reading a statement that sounded heavily rehearsed. Louis, he said, had received a formal diagnosis. The condition would require long-term treatment, reduce his public appearances, and force major changes to his daily routine. And then he reached the phrase, "our youngest son," and his voice just broke. Anne lowered her eyes, not out of discomfort, but because she understood exactly what that crack in his composure was about to unleash once the word spread. She had spent weeks arguing with him about this exact moment. She believed silence had become dangerous, that letting rumors spiral would be far worse than controlling the message themselves. But William feared disclosure would trap his son inside a label he never chose, and Catherine sat somewhere painfully in the middle, furious at the idea of reducing her child to a palace press notice. That conflict sat between all three of them as they stood united in front of the cameras. And honestly, the fact that they presented a unified front at all, given what had been happening in private, is kind of remarkable. The diagnosis didn't come out of nowhere, which is the part that makes the timeline so painful once you start piecing together what was happening in the months leading up to this moment. Specialists had quietly been tracking episodes of unexplained fatigue, unstable balance, and moments when Louis appeared to lose control of his hands for some time. Symptoms would surface and then settle back down, which is why early check pointed toward exhaustion or a passing developmental issue rather than anything neurological. Catherine noticed every single flicker of change, but the symptoms were so inconsistent that she feared alarming her son before anyone could actually explain what was happening. William clung to the exhaustion explanation because it gave him somewhere comfortable to put his hope. He told himself that rest and routine would restore the boy's strength, and the family could quietly keep life normal. That belief completely collapsed during a private rehearsal at Windsor, a closed preparation run for a future appearance where the family practices movement and timing before any public event. Louis crossed the reception room toward his father and suddenly lost control of his balance. There was no toy in his path, no playful distraction. One moment he was moving forward, and the next he was on the floor, confused and frightened, while William rushed toward him and the entire room froze. He tried to rise but couldn't make his legs fully respond. William dropped beside him and asked him to squeeze both hands. The child gripped one firmly, but the other barely moved, and the look on William's face shifted from worry to quiet terror within seconds. Catherine saw several aides still staring and ordered the room cleared with an anger born from panic, not pride. Anne moved immediately, closing the doors and instructing staff to remove every unofficial reference to the incident from the internal schedule the private calendar used to coordinate royal activity. She was not going to allow Louis's fear to become palace gossip. A physician examined Louis moments later and recognized the pattern immediately. The fall matched the earlier fatigue, the unstable balance, the weak grip, and he urged immediate neurological testing while warning William that delay could cost valuable treatment time. That's when Anne discovered something that made her anger turn cold. 2 earlier episodes had been dismissed by junior staff as childish clumsiness. She demanded names, dates, and every written account. William followed the specialist into a private corridor and asked the question no father wants to speak aloud: could his son recover completely? And the doctor paused before answering. That silence struck harder than any diagnosis. So the fall created the emergency, but the final test results created an entirely different battle. Because William, Catherine, and Anne were about to disagree fundamentally over whether protecting Louis meant keeping the truth hidden or speaking before someone else did. And this argument didn't take place in front of advisors or doctors. It happened behind a closed door with no aides present, just the 3 of them facing a question no protocol could answer. William feared losing control of the story. Catherine feared losing control of her child's life and dreaded that hesitation would let outsiders make the decision for them. Catherine read the final diagnostic report twice before setting it down. The specialists had confirmed the condition was serious yet manageable with early and sustained treatment, which meant hope remained, but only if Louis received time, protection, and freedom from unnecessary pressure. Palace communications officials had already drafted a limited statement because canceled family appearances were beginning to attract attention, and a palace statement is basically an official message released to control what the public is told. To William, silence was becoming dangerous. Catherine pushed the draft back across the table and said it sounded cold, distant, almost constitutional, that nothing in it captured the fear Louis had shown after the fall or the confusion in his voice when the adults around him lowered theirs. She told him, "He is our son, not a palace statement." William answered that refusing to speak would not stop the story, that if fragments leaked first, their child would be left exposed without protection. His voice rose when Catherine accused him of thinking like a future monarch before thinking like a father. He insisted he was doing both because he had no other choice. She told him that choice was exactly what Louis was losing. Anne remained silent through all of this, but the tension sharpened around her because she had watched them carry grief in different ways, and now those differences were splitting open in the same room. Then Anne dropped information that changed the entire calculation. Through a private household briefing she had personally reviewed, she revealed that someone within the wider royal staff had already requested access to Louis's revised schedule. She refused to identify the person until she understood why the request had been made, but the warning alone was enough. The secret was already moving beyond the family, and she proposed a joint confirmation led by William with herself directly beside him to absorb any intrusive pressure. The title Princess Royal is traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, and she would act as both witness and shield. Catherine would remain, with Louis, far from the machinery surrounding the announcement. William stood and moved toward the door, and Catherine stopped him by softly saying his name. He turned and she pressed the medical file against his chest and told him that if he spoke, he must speak as a father, not as the future king. Anne set down her pen and promised that no royal timetable would ever outrank the boy's treatment. The family had reached agreement, but courage alone was not going to protect Louis, because inside the monarchy, compassion does not always control the calendar. And this is where Anne's role becomes absolutely critical to understanding how this family is going to function from this point forward. William may carry the future, but in the hours after the diagnosis, it became clear that Anne understands how to turn grief into concrete action in a way that nobody else in that family currently does. She knows which officials will cooperate, which traditions can be suspended without breaking protocol, and which voices will quietly resist behind polite expressions. Her power does not come from a crown waiting somewhere in the future. It comes from decades of unbroken service and refusal to let royal machinery consume a vulnerable child. She began by reviewing every single obligation attached to Louis's name: family appearances, ceremonial rehearsals, travel plans, events requiring prolonged standing, all of it placed under immediate scrutiny. An engagement book is the official working calendar used to organize royal duties, and each entry now carried a different weight. What used to feel routine could now leave the child exhausted, exposed, or quietly frightened. William gave his aunt full authority to negotiate the changes, and he moved between medical consultations, Catherine, and the other children, while guilt followed him through every corridor. He worried that asking his aunt to fight the institution on Louis's behalf meant abandoning his own duty. And she ended that thought with one short sentence: "Your place is where Louis looks for you." He went quiet because he knew she was right. Anne faced resistance almost immediately. Several officials warned that removing the boy from public occasions would create visible gaps and fuel speculation, and she could hear the cold calculation beneath their concern. They were protecting appearance while a child was learning how to trust his own body again. Her anger rose, but she controlled it, because one uncontrolled confrontation could turn Louis's treatment into a wider palace war she could not win. Then she uncovered an older household protocol requiring young royal children to maintain limited ceremonial participation unless they were shown to be physically incapable. A household protocol is an internal rule guiding how members of the family carry out official expectations, and she rejected the wording immediately. Emotional safety and active treatment, she argued, have to be enough. A child should not have to collapse before tradition permits him to rest. A senior official still refused to cancel one major appearance, warning that the absence could dominate headlines and weaken public confidence. And Anne placed the specialist's written recommendation on the table and accepted personal responsibility for overriding the schedule. When he continued explaining the reputational consequences, she closed the engagement book with one firm movement and said the discussion was finished. She left the meeting and entered an empty side room where, for one brief moment, her shoulders fell and the composure drained from her face. Then William called. She answered with a steady voice and told him the calendar had been changed. The first battle had been won, but the deeper damage was already beginning to surface because Catherine was about to discover that people no longer see Louis before they see his diagnosis. The morning after the announcement, Windsor felt unfamiliar to the family actually living inside it. Messages arrived from around the world. Security procedures shifted. Staff began speaking more carefully whenever Louis entered a room. Nothing openly cruel happened. But Catherine noticed something that frightened her almost as much as the diagnosis itself. People were no longer reacting to her son before they reacted to his condition. In trying to express care, the palace had quietly begun making him feel like he was being watched. Louis faced changes he had never asked for. His public engagements were suspended. His schooling was revised and medical therapy was folded into every week. Public engagements are official appearances carried out on behalf of the royal family, and removing them protects his health, while also drawing sudden attention to his absence. William and Catherine explained the diagnosis in simple words. His body needs extra help with balance and movement, but he is still exactly the same boy. Louis wanted to believe them. Then an aide reached for an item he had always carried alone, and the child pulled it back sharply, asking why everyone suddenly thinks he cannot do anything by himself. Catherine heard the anger beneath the question. It was not only frustration, it was fear that the diagnosis had quietly changed how every adult around him measures his worth. She confronted the household later that day, not shouting, but with each word landing with the weight of a parent who has had enough. Support must never become humiliation. Staff must ask before touching, carrying, guiding, or stepping in. Her grief hardened into protection because kindness without respect can still wound deeply, and she refused to let concern slowly steal her son's independence. Meanwhile, William received a private message from a trusted communications advisor warning that details beyond the official statement were already circulating. Details mentioning the weak grip, the sudden fall, and the delayed response of one hand at the Windsor rehearsal. Those details were never released to the press. Someone inside the household had spoken, and Anne began tracing every person present during the incident. Through a documented internal account, she discovered that one aide had contacted an external advisor shortly after the fall, believing the palace needed to prepare for a public crisis. The decision may have been born out of fear, but it placed Louis's private pain in dangerous hands. Louis later tried to cross a garden path alone, and halfway through his confidence broke, and he simply stopped. William did not rush forward this time. He waited until his son reached out for him, and then took his hand without lifting or carrying him. That small choice said what words in that moment simply could not. William removed Louis's prepared schedule from the notice board that evening, and replaced it with a blank sheet telling Catherine that their son's life would no longer be arranged around royal expectation. But the deepest wound stayed hidden. because Louis was about to tell Anne what he actually feared most, and it had almost nothing to do with treatment. The crisis changed direction not in a formal meeting, but during a private conversation between a fiercely protective aunt who had become a kind of grandmother figure and a quietly frightened child. With no advisors, cameras, or medical language between them, Louis finally admitted what the diagnosis had made him secretly believe about himself. He was not most afraid of treatment. He was afraid his father would stop being proud of him. For Anne, that single confession exposed the true battle the family now had to fight. She had been spending more time alone with Louis after noticing how quiet he became whenever William walked into the room. The boy watched his father closely, measuring every step, every pause, every small unsteady movement against the prince's reaction. Louis had overheard adults discussing which royal duties would now have to be cancelled, and without understanding the full reason, he began to believe he had failed his own family. He finally asked whether William would still take him to important events when he grew older. The question sounds simple, but Anne heard the sharp fear hiding inside it. He was not asking about ceremonies. He was asking whether illness had quietly removed him from his father's future. Anne answered carefully, telling him that adults sometimes make children feel responsible for pain they never caused. William's sadness, she explained, comes from love and fear, never disappointment. The future king is not grieving the child standing in front of him. He is grieving the fact that his son has to face something he simply cannot fight on his behalf. Then Louis revealed something during that private conversation that honestly reframes the entire timeline leading up to the diagnosis. He had noticed his own balance changing well before the Windsor fall. He had stumbled in private and hidden it. He had dropped things and said nothing because he did not want Catherine or William to worry. Anne felt the truth strike hard, because his effort to appear brave may have actually delayed the family from understanding what was happening. Yet she refused to let guilt replace fear, and promised that he would never again have to hide pain just to protect the adults around him. When Louis asked her to swear that his father was still proud of him, she removed a small service pin from her jacket and placed it gently in his palm. A service pin is a small symbol worn to mark dutiful service and commitment. She told him, "Courage is not standing without falling. It is telling someone when help is genuinely needed." William entered the room a little later, and Louis spoke before fear could stop him, admitting that he thought he had quietly become a burden. The prince knelt, pulled him close, and said, "The family will change every plan that has to be changed, but it will never ask him to earn his place." That single promise changes everything, because once Louis understood he had not lost his father's pride, the family was finally ready to face the world. And the world's response turned out to be far more emotional than anyone inside Windsor had quietly braced for. By sunrise, the diagnosis was no longer only a family crisis. It had become a moment shared by millions of parents who understand the terror of hearing that a child's life has suddenly changed shape. Outside Windsor Castle, handwritten notes appeared beside flowers and small toys. Broadcasters abandoned their usual language of royal strategy and spoke instead about vulnerability, childhood, and the quiet fear parents try not to pass on. For once, the monarchy was not being watched from a polite distance. It was being embraced. William saw the morning newspapers lead with his joint confirmation beside Anne, the coverage focusing less on succession politics and more on the pain in a father's voice and the protective calm of the Princess Royal. Succession refers to the official order determining who will inherit the throne, but for one day that machinery felt almost irrelevant. The public was not asking what the diagnosis means for the crown. They were asking what it means for a small child. Medical charities responded with calls for greater awareness of neurological conditions affecting young people. Families began sharing recorded messages and written accounts about treatment, fear, and the long process of adapting to a different future. William was deeply moved by their honesty. Yet the attention still troubled him, because sympathy can comfort a family, but it can also quietly become pressure if Louis begins to believe that he has to perform courage for strangers. Catherine refused a proposal for a staged photograph. She would not place her son before the public simply to reassure people watching from outside. The princess understood that Louis was still learning how to name his own fear, and asking him to smile for the nation would turn private confusion into another duty he never signed up for. Anne offered a different path, a short written response thanking every family who had shared its story. with no new medical details and no demand that the boy appear. William agreed and then quietly added one personal sentence. His son's worth has never depended on ceremonial duty, physical ability, or public expectation. That single line changed the emotional tone of the entire day. At Cambridge Gate, one of Windsor Castle's main public entrances, a small group of parents placed a blue ribbon around a soft toy crown. Beside it rested a card reading, "For Louis, strength is asking for a hand." A national broadcaster showed the tribute during its evening bulletin and called it the image that captured the country's collective feeling. William watched the report privately with Anne and recognized the message immediately, because it echoed almost word for word what she had given Louis in confidence. He turned toward his aunt, unable to speak, and she simply nodded. The world had delivered its answer with compassion, but the final verdict still belonged to William, because he alone had to decide whether the crown would continue shaping Louis, or finally reshape itself around him. The diagnosis cannot be reversed by rank, privilege, or tradition, and William knows this now. He cannot command his son's body to heal. He cannot erase the fear from Catherine's heart, and he cannot guarantee that the road ahead will be easy. But he can decide what the monarchy demands from Louis. He can decide whether a child must keep struggling to fit an ancient institution, or whether that institution must finally learn, slowly and honestly, to bend. His final choice becomes the clearest preview of his future reign. William gathered Catherine, Anne, and the senior household leadership for one final meeting. The panic had passed. No one was still fighting over leaks or statements or cancelled appearances. They were deciding what kind of life Louis would be allowed to live. Senior household leadership refers to the officials who organize royal duties and advise the family on public responsibilities. And for once, those responsibilities were being placed firmly beneath the child's health. Medical specialists confirmed that treatment may improve Louis's stability and independence, but nobody can promise a fixed timeline. Progress will come slowly, unevenly, and without regard for ceremony. William admitted that his first instinct had been to preserve normality by keeping parts of the old schedule intact, but he now saw the danger in that instinct, because it would have forced his son to prove he could still meet expectations that were created long before the diagnosis existed. Catherine asked the question still quietly haunting her, whether removing every obligation could make Louis feel excluded from his own family's future. Anne answered with calm certainty. Protection does not mean permanent isolation. It means offering him a genuine choice, without guilt, pressure, or public punishment. The Princess Royal knows the difference between duty freely chosen and duty forced upon a frightened child. William made the decision final. Every automatic ceremonial expectation placed on Louis during childhood was abolished. Ceremonial expectations are the formal appearances and traditions royal children are normally prepared to perform. And from now on, he will attend only when he wishes, when his parents agree, and when his doctors believe it is safe. William went further, establishing a protected family policy that the medical needs of every royal child must take priority over public schedules. Louis's diagnosis will not become a quiet exception hidden behind palace walls. It will create permanent, visible change. William lifted the old engagement calendar and tore out the pages carrying his son's cancelled duties, then placed a blank diary in front of Catherine and said, "From now on, his life is written around who he is, not around what they expected him to be." Catherine closed her eyes as relief finally broke through her control and placed a small hand on the future king's shoulder, because his greatest act of leadership had not been the use of royal power. It had been the decision to limit it. William later explained everything to Louis, and the boy asked whether he may still attend important events when he feels strong enough. His father smiled and told him that the choice will always belong to him. The diagnosis has changed a young life, but it has not diminished Louis, separated him from his father, or weakened his place within the family. Anne's loyalty gave them strength. William's courage gave that strength meaning, and together they turned tragedy into lasting protection. The crown does not emerge untouched from this. It emerges changed. For generations, royal children were expected to adapt themselves to duty. But in this moment, duty adapts itself to a child. There is no further secret waiting behind the palace doors, and no unresolved verdict left to deliver. Prince Louis remains fully loved, fully protected, and fully part of the family he was born into. The monarchy will change before it ever asks him to become less than himself. A quick note before you go, this video is commentary on circulating reports and unverified claims. None of the medical details discussed here have been confirmed by Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, or any official household source, and this channel does not present speculation as established fact. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.